next 10 years if the government doesn't take any action right now. So with that, the World Bank actually, in working with the government, to formulate some sort of, we call the long-term coastal resilience program, which are the multiple phases of the support. You can see along with the 5 recommendations made by reports, the support actually focus on the 4 themes, including building understanding of the risks from the government, not only from individual government officials, but also entire planning system of the country, especially spatial planning. At the same time, better understanding of risks actually can help the infrastructure sectors or live industries to be able to maintain and construct or to build the more resilient, the access to be more resilient to the coastal in the coastal area. Together with that, this other financing is one of the very important that enable community.
Không phải chỉ của chính phủ, các tỉnh mà cộng đồng cũng cần phải huy động các nguồn lực để
emergency response and recovery aftermath of the disaster, as well as also to invest the long-term disaster protection system in their communities. We include also, like insurance programs or social safety net, the social safety net, that sort of thing actually need to be improved in the countries. Last but not least, of course, emergency response system of the country need to be also improved, particularly at the lower level. For instance, like the last year storm and flood in the coastal area, you probably also have seen a lot in the media that a lot of people actually were living scatteredly in some of the government officer building without some of the basic services provided during their evacuation. So the system, let's say the system of evacuation infrastructure need to be also put in place along with the basic services provision and also the early warning system. That also need to be improved along the coastal. So next slide, please. Here you see that's the last slide from us. You see actually the long-term multiple phases support for the coastal resilience, which include the 5 phases and covering for 20 years or 25 years. So each of the phase actually is trying also to build the lesson learned and to build a model for the specific coastal threats or specific water in the certain area of the countries, and that can replicate and scale up further down from the north to the south. So the government of Vietnam right now is working with the World Bank for the first phase investment, which we are expecting to have a start to be implemented in 2023. So I will stop here and over to you, Justin. If any question, both Matai and I are happy to answer. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, thanks, Matthias. Very, very interesting, very good presentation. We will have time for questions at the end, so please have a look at the bottom of your screen. You'll see there's a Q&A section. Please put your questions in there, and at the end we'll ask the panelists to address those comments. Our next speaker joins us from Royal Australian DHD, and that is Joost Lansen. Joost is a port and coastal engineer with expertise in hydrodynamics, coastal development, and project management. In addition to his role as a specialist consultant, Joost has also lectured part-time at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. Over to you, Joost.
Yes, can you hear me? Thumbs up? Yes, okay, very good. Let me also share my screen. Okay, I hope everybody can see my screen. Yeah, thank you for the nice introduction and also a very nice presentation before me. So what I want to do is to go in my presentation a little bit deeper in more detail in understanding coastal erosion and what can we do about it. So what I will cover in my presentation. So my objective with this presentation is that I will share some of the understanding of the key issues related to erosion. So why does it happen? What can we do about it? And also to share experience from me and our company. How can we define and implement coastal protection solutions? So I will touch upon various topics. The first one is the problems. So what are the problems resulting from coastal erosion? Secondly, what are the causes? So what causes coastal erosion? Thirdly, prevention and solutions. Also, what can we do about it? And lastly, how can we implement these preventive or protection solutions? A little bit of an introduction about myself. Justin already gave it. So my name is Joost Lansen. So I work over 15 years. I have experience in coastal engineering globally, but I'm working in Vietnam for about 8 years. So I've been working on quite some projects along the coastline, and I've been seeing a lot of changes over time. And I work for Royal Haskoning DHV. So my company, we work on various projects related to coastal engineering. We're originally from the Netherlands, so we have a strong water protection background, and we are active in Vietnam for 40 years, working in coastal resilience. So it's a bit of an introduction about who's talking to you at the moment. So what are the problems related to coastal erosions? So firstly, I think this is a very nice quote, which we found on TripAdvisor. This was a tourist. He came on holiday to Vietnam, and it reads, after unpacking we went over and saw the entire beach had been washed away. As Book.com informed us, no beach, just a sheer drop to where the waves were crashing into. What a disappointment. Later it says, well, last night we were having a cocktail on the beach bar, which is hanging on a cliff edge, and a digger came down to the beach as the tide had gone out and was moving sand to try and rectify, but obviously caused by a monsoon. This shows, and also what's shown in the pictures on the right, is that due to local erosion at various developments, and for the tourist sector, the quality of the beaches is going down, and obviously that's viewed negatively. It's not only the tourist sector, of course. We see also in the news that coastal erosion affects a lot of other types of industries. So it's also related to fishing ports, but also just people living in residential areas. So not only is it affecting the private tourist sector, but it's actually affecting a lot of the lives of coastal people. And I think Matthijs also showed some nice examples. So what is really the problem then with coastal erosion? So what really the problem is, so coastal erosion leads to loss of the beach, which in the end results in an unattractive coastline for tourists. And so the beach is gone, which is reducing the experience of the tourist there. It also damages the property. And so we see a lot of property being damaged along the coastline. And so when it's being built, often we see a nice beach, but over time, due to erosion or during storms, a lot of property is being damaged. And lastly, there's also a loss of the natural and the cultural value of the coastline. So a lot of people appreciate, obviously, the beautiful Vietnam beaches. It's being used for fisheries, but also by the local population to go out, but that's being lost. Lastly, so the invested value of a lot of these properties is going down. So because of the appreciation of the visitors of a eroded beach, actually the property value will go down because the appreciation is much lower. And we see a lot of these examples along the coastline. So what causes coastal erosion? So I would like to demonstrate in the coming slides a little bit of the engineering insight in why coastal erosion occurs, because we think that's very important to have that understanding to also later on develop protection solutions and management solutions, how you would mitigate erosion. So I will touch upon three main causes. So the first one is natural dynamics. As Matthijs also pointed out, so there's a natural dynamics of erosion and accretion, so that's part of what nature does. And secondly, it's human activities. Human activities have an impact on the coastline. And lastly, climate change. So first of all, if we look at the beach, you see here a very nice beach with water and waves and a surf zone. Actually, this beach is subject to the forces of nature. So that's tides, currents, wind, and waves. So if we look at the coastline, this is a schematic picture. We see that there's a beach, there's water, there's waves. But what you often don't see clearly when you're standing on the beach is that there's a longshore drift. So there's always some kind of flow flowing along the coastline, which transports water, but it also transports sand. So because what we see, so in the foreshore, there's sand movement, which is being transported by this flow, and it flows as some kind of sand river along the coastline. Not only this is moving sand, but we also see that sand moves from the beach onto the seabed. So throughout the year, sand is moved from the beach onto the seabed. As a result of this, we see actually that there's a natural variation in the accretion and erosion. So during storms or seasonal variations, waves can be higher, and as a result of that, there will be erosion. So sand is actually put in the foreshore, and in the calm season, actually the sand is going back to the beach. So when you visit some beaches at different periods of the year, you would see actually that there's erosion and accretion. So one of the key messages about this is that the coastline is by nature dynamic. So any beach needs also some space to breathe. So when planning and looking at coastal developments, you always need to make sure, let's say, that the coastline can follow its own dynamics and it has this space to breathe. So building close to the coastline is often not a very good idea. Secondly, when we look at human activities, so what we often see is that for property developments, often there are structures being built on the coastline, which actually block this longshore transport I was talking about. And so this flow of sand along the coastline is being blocked, for instance, by a groin. There's an example in this upper right corner. And as a result of it, one side of this groin, actually, because of the blocking, it will get more sand, whereas the other side, there will be less sand, leading to erosion. And what we often see, so the person on the left, he is very happy, so he has a very nice beach, but the person on the right-hand side, obviously, he's less happy because his beach has been eroded by the structure which must be built probably by the person to the left. And often this is an ongoing process. So the next neighbor also will make something, and then the one next to will be unhappy. So I think the conclusion is, or the takeaway from this, is that when we look at these kind of developments, we also have to look at, let's say, the surroundings, the neighbor. And there's only a solution to, let's say, make a resilient and sustainable beach is to work together, because this process will go on, and it will not solve the problem altogether. So not only we see that with groins, but often we sometimes also see revetments being built. Obviously, this stops the erosion, but also here, the neighbor will be suffering, and it's also questionable whether maybe the erosion is stopped, but this leads to a high-value beach. Now, when we look along the coastline of Vietnam, I think there were some pictures already. So this is a picture of a beach in Hue Nay. This was in 2008. We see a very nice natural coastline. But when we look at the situation today, we see these various structures have been built to protect some beaches along the coastline for various resorts. But at some places, the beach has disappeared completely. And so in this particular situation, some people have been protecting their coastline, but by not approaching it in a consistent way with all the neighbors in the areas, about half of the beach has disappeared. Now, when we look at the third cause of coastal erosion, that's climate change. So we know that due to climate change, sea levels rise, and when sea levels rise, it will in the end result in coastal retreat, because the water level in the end is higher, so it will approach the beach in a higher way. But more importantly, we see that part of the effects of climate change is that storms will be more intense, or monsoon seasons will be stronger, and that leads to more erosion than accretion in a dynamic situation. And as a result of that, beaches erode. So even without any human intervention, we would see, let's say, the beach retreating as a result of climate change. And one of the conclusions to be made here is that we know climate change is happening. So if we don't do anything to increase the coastal resilience, erosion for sure will happen. Measures are for sure required, otherwise the beach will erode anyway. So obviously, as I said, there's solutions to work against coastal protection. So I will touch upon a little bit of what kind of solutions can we think about. Obviously, this is not going into high detail, but there I will touch upon the main, the key understandings. So what are the benefits actually of protecting the coastline? Obviously, you not only mitigate the negative impact of coastal erosion, but you also protect the development itself, and you also protect the beach. So without coastal protection, if the beach is gone, there's also a loss for the natural environment, but also for the society as a whole. So people enjoying on the beach is not possible anymore. Coastal erosion also reduces the risk of loss of property. So what we see is that the beach is actually quite a good natural protection against, for instance, storms or typhoons. And without a beach, the damage to property during storms is often much higher. And coming back to what I said earlier, a nice beach also enhances the value of the investment. And so property will be much more valued if there's a nice beach line in front of it. And lastly, if there's proper coastal protection, is ready and resilient for the future to be ready for the effects of climate change. So what kind of solutions do we have? There's all kind of different solutions which we can think about. First of all, coming back to what I said earlier, a beach needs space to breathe. So proper planning and management is very important. And so not building developments too close to the coastline, or not, so to make sure that the beach has sufficient space to breathe is very important. So that's planning and management. Secondly, we call engineering soft solutions. These are classified as, for instance, beach nourishment. And so putting more sand on the beach, a buffer of sand, which can be spread out around the coastline, will help, let's say, to make the beach stable and give it also space to breathe. Lastly, we have hard solutions, engineering hard solutions. So you see a few examples here. And these are, let's say, rock structures which limit the effect of waves on the beach. And as a result of that, they keep the sand on the beach in a stable way. Most of the time.
Ở trong trường hợp thì cái giải pháp tốt nhất là cái sự tổng hợp của tất cả các phương án này. Tức là chúng ta ví dụ như là các giải pháp mềm cũng giải pháp cứng.
The reef is often the optimal solution for a particular coastline. So when we think about these protection solutions, how are we developing these? What steps would we normally make to come up with solutions for these properties? There's a few steps we often made in when we develop the solutions, and I will try to highlight step by step how these steps are being made and what kind of activities are important. So the first step often is an inception phase where we try to understand the dynamics. As I said earlier, it's very important to understand the dynamics of the coastline to come up with proper solutions. So what we try to do in the first step is often identify the key issues. So why is erosion happening? Is it a result of storms? Is it a result of human structures in the neighborhood? And what is the reason? Secondly, data collection supports that. So there's a lot of data available which can support building up that understanding. Thirdly, we always, when we want to prepare coastal protection solutions, we also need to identify what are the requirements. What type of coastal protection do we need? Are there any requirements from a master plan, regional master plan or national master plan? What are specific requirements from the property development? For instance, if it's a resort, are there swimming condition improvements required? And lastly, obviously, we would like to minimize the negative coastal impact as much as possible. So in identifying these kind of requirements in a first step is important. A second step would be that we select a wide range of concept alternatives. And so these are all alternatives to protect the coastline against coastal erosion. And you see some examples here, but it can be many. Also, as I said, planning or beach nourishment, etc. But preparing a lot of alternatives is often good to do an evaluation which layout concept alternative is the best. If we review these kind of concepts, we take into account, for instance, what are owner preferences. And so there's if there's a development on the coastline, what does the owner want? Secondly, very important, as I said earlier, what are the specific coastal impacts of each of these alternatives? How can they be quantified? In this step, often also stakeholder involvement is important. So the previous presentation also said it's often common interest to come up with sustainable solutions. So here in this layout assessment, we look into, we often talk to various parties to see what the best solution can be. And lastly, we'll obviously also look at costs. It's often an investment to make coastal protection. However, it also has a lot of benefits, especially over the lifetime of a structure and a development. So that's why life cycle costs are important. This assessment often then results in a preferred layout. A more detailed step, when we are looking into a more detailed step about how we develop these kind of engineering solutions, we would do surveys, surveys of the seabed, ocean surveys of waves, currents, and geotechnical information. This is all needed to gain information in the understanding of the coastline. One of the most important tools which we are using is numerical models. Numerical models are able to calculate the longshore transport, what I presented earlier, and these numerical models can also then quantify and estimate what the impact will be of these various coastal protection solutions on the coastline. And by testing various of these alternatives, we can select, let's say, an optimum solution, which protects obviously the beach at the project at the local location, but we can also limit the impact of the development of the adjacent coastline. When we have a good understanding of the required solution, and we go to more detail into schematic design of the structures that can be groins or breakwaters, etc. Now, lastly, when we have a good understanding and exactly know the dimensions of the structures, we do a detailed design in which we very in high detail design these kind of protection solutions. That can obviously, as we hear one example, rock, but it can also be a detailed design of a nourishment or a planning solution. One of the speakers after us will also tell a bit more in detail about physical models. Physical models can be used to test some of these protection solutions, whether they are suitable for the local climate, but also whether cost optimizations can be made. So this can be a tool for in the design. And lastly, obviously, as construction. So my presentation, so what are the key takeaways, what we would like to convey and would ask the participants to bring home later this afternoon. So firstly, coastal erosion destroys property and reduces the quality of the beaches. As I've shown, it's not only for tourism, but it's for all kind of industries. And because of a vanishing beach, the appreciation would be lower and we lose, let's say, the natural value of the coastline. Erosion occurs as a result of various causes. It's natural dynamics, human interventions, and also climate change. We have to understand these natural processes to develop resilient coastal protection solutions. So we have to have a good understanding why it's occurring, why does coastal erosion occurs at that site. And when we develop design solutions, we go from step by step in let's say, understanding why, what solution will be best for the site to protect against erosion. And when we come up with these solutions, we need to consider also the adjacent coastline, and collaboration with various parties is required. If we don't do that, we may solve it at one location, but we create problems in other locations. So lastly, so if we want to have a nice beach, it's a common interest for us all, so engineers, but also developers, maybe the government, institutes, universities, so that we work together and then come up with good solutions to protect our coastline of Vietnam. Thank you for your attention. Back to you, Justin.
Thanks, Ed. Very interesting presentation. Good to see the different solutions on offer, and good to see the questions coming through and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. Our next speakers join us from the Water Research Laboratory in New South Wales, Australia. Matt Blacker is a chartered professional engineer specializing in the field of coastal processes and hazards, estuary processes, coastal structures, and coastal climate change adaptation. He's joined by James Carley. James is a principal coastal engineer with over 30 years of experience. He has served on the Engineers Australia, New South Wales Coastal, Ocean and Port Engineering Panel, and is currently chair of the Engineers Australia National Committee on Coastal and Ocean Engineering. Over to Matt and James. I think you need to stop sharing your screen, please, Joost.
Okay, can you hear me and see my screen? Okay, thanks everybody. So I'm going to talk about the history of coastal structure design and physical modelling. Okay, it doesn't seem to want to go full screen, so I'll persist how it is now. So where Matt and myself work, the Water Research Laboratory is in Sydney, Australia. We've been operating since 1959. Sydney is very famous for its very famous building, the Sydney Opera House. We also have many high-quality beaches. We also have fairly unique ocean pools that are right on the edge of the ocean as well. And the Water Research Laboratory is situated close to the ocean in Sydney, and we sit here beneath an old dam. So we have water, and we do coastal engineering and groundwater and civil engineering hydraulics. Just a little bit about me. Justin's already introduced me. So yeah, I've been a coastal engineer for about 30 years. I'm also a surfer who rides the waves of the ocean. I've been doing that for 45 years. Also a lifeguard and lifesaver that rescues people in the ocean as well. So I've done that. I train junior lifesavers as well to become lifeguards into the future. This is me riding a wave when I was a bit younger and more crazy. And I'm also the chair of Engineers Australia's National Coastal Committee. So some of the earliest coastal structures around the world wasn't so much for houses or tourism like we have now, it was because of shipwrecks. So the ships would go around the world for trade and they get smashed on the rock. So then society started building lighthouses to prevent the shipwreck. So this is one of the earliest lighthouses built. This was an 1824 book picture, a drawing of a lighthouse in Scotland. And believe it or not, this is about the earliest physical modelling I know of, and this is a reproduction. So this is not a real photo because there was no cameras in 1800. But when they designed this, the Bell Rock Lighthouse in Scotland, they actually set up a system that they filled up with water, and they built the lighthouse in front of the water tank and then ran a jet of water down to see if the lighthouse would collapse. So this was around about 1800, first physical model I know of in the world. And they always, with the physical modelling, you always try and test it to destruction. So if it stands up, you always put a bigger event in and a bigger one and a bigger one to work out how much it can actually handle to actually collapse. Now that was the Bell Rock Lighthouse in Scotland. That was the 1800 physical model. That lighthouse was built in 1807, and here it is present day, still there. So it's now the oldest lighthouse in the world that's sitting in the waves. So it's in the tidal zone, it's hit by waves every single day, and its design was originally optimised using the physical model. So that was one of the oldest examples I can find. Moving a bit more into the modern era. So some of the recent coastal engineering references. So the first major reference in coastal engineering design comes from 1938 by a Spanish engineer, Iribarren, his name was, and he still has legacy in coastal engineering. So he published a paper about how to work out how big rocks need to be to withstand a certain size wave. And that got translated into English, which is my language, in 1949. In the 1950s, the US Army Corps of Engineers came along and started doing their own work. So what's called the Hudson equation, which is still used to this day for some coastal engineers for rock breakwater, That was done in 1953. So then, from the 1950s onwards, the US Army Corps of Engineers became one of the dominant thought leaders in coastal engineering. So they started producing major publications starting in 1957. And my organisation, Water Research Laboratory, where Matt and I work, we opened in 1959 to provide advice in this realm. 1973, what was called the Shore Protection Manual was produced, and that is still one of the iconic textbooks for coastal engineering to this day, and it got revised quite often up until 1984. There was a lot of coastal engineering work in the Netherlands, and I have Dutch colleagues here today. I won't speak on their behalf, but the very famous Vandermeer equation, it came out in 1988 from the Netherlands, and that's very commonly used now for rock breakwaters and rock seat walls. 1991, England put out what's called the Syria Rock Manual, and there's been a revision in that. And then during the 2000s, the US Army Corps of Engineers revised their shore protection manual into a coastal engineering manual. Along the way as well, the Swiss International Standards Organisation put out the international standard about the actions of waves and currents on coastal structures. So that's a brief summary of available documents, major documents for coastal engineering design. And this is just really the front cover of some of those documents. So this is the 1977 Coastal Engineering Manual, and it is still used by a lot of coastal engineers for some design purposes. And the one on the right is the 1984 Shore Protection Manual, still very widely used. And there's parts of that that are still remain state of the art, even though it's supposed to have been replaced by the Coastal Engineering Manual, which is a 2000s type document. And there's also a lot of really interesting information in the Rock Manual, which comes from England, the UK. So a little bit of a history of coastal modelling, physical modelling in Australia. This is the earliest photo I can find in Australia of a physical model. This is a harbour development in 1951 in Australia. And this is a more recent picture of what a physical model might look like in action. And it's doing two different things. It's looking at the stability of the rocks sitting here to see how stable those rocks are. But also looking at this wall on the top of it to see how effectively the wall can stop the waves going over the top of it. So it's doing two separate things, that physical model. So all the textbooks and the design codes that I mentioned earlier, they all provide calculations for how to design coastal protection works, but they all recommend that the publications are used for initial design, and then if it's an important project, you need to physically model it, because that's the only way to get high certainty in the design. By physically modelling it, it does the following things. It reduces the risk of failure. That's probably the most important thing, but also can reduce the risk of over-design. So it stops the structure being more expensive than it needs to be. And it provides a faithful 3D picture or model of the project, which is really nice to look at. It allows very large storms to be visualised. So you can dial in any event you want and see what it looks like in the model. So the physical model almost always pays for itself through reduced risk on the project. So some of the pioneering work done by the Water Research Laboratory over the last few decades were CBs. These were done in the 1970s. They look like a beehive, concrete hexagon. So these 1970s, they were developed at Water Research Lab. Here's a model test of a CB wall happening. These are geobags. So these are large sandbags full of sand. So this is one close to us. They're often used for short-term protection. And we also did a large amount of physical modelling on these to test them to destruction and came up with a design curve for geobags, work out how big a wave the geobag can withstand. Something a bit more recent. So this is the major coastal road in New Zealand, and waves come over the top and damage the cars and the people and the bicycles here. So the waves come over the top of the wall here, through the channel here, and you can see the outcome on the top left. So we did a physical model of that and ran the waves over onto it, and we can find ways to reduce the overtopping, either through putting extra structures at the base or putting another wall, a wave return wall at the top of it here to stop the waves coming over to protect it. For temporary protection in Australia, the most common product used in recent years is what's called a Kiowa bag, which comes from Japan. And these look like it's a netted bag full of rocks, and it can be handled by a crane. They're quite quick to fill, So they've been used for emergency protection in Australia in recent years. But you can see it here in front of these houses to stop these houses collapsing in. So we're just at the moment doing some design curves for those where we filter a bit amount of fibre bags, we run waves, and we work out how big a wave they can withstand before they fail, so that we can develop some design curves so that they can design better. So I'll now hand over to Matt Blackett. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be here to answer any questions at the end. Thank you.
Okay, hopefully you can see my screen there. Is that right, Justin? Okay, very good. Okay, thank you everybody, and good afternoon, it's good evening for me. I'm going to pick up where James left off and provide a bit more of a contemporary summary on the use of physical models as a design tool within modern coastal engineering projects. And we've heard previous speakers talk about some of the dynamics of the coastal zone and the challenges of building infrastructure in the coastal zone or having infrastructure closely positioned to the coast. The coastal zone is a very unforgiving place to have infrastructure, and it's also a very unforgiving place to design infrastructure. And if we get it wrong, we can often make the problems of erosion or sea levels or wave hazards worse than what they were to start with. So models are a tool, as you've pointed out, that really allow us to be able to design with a little bit more understanding and certainty of what the coastal processes are and the localized coastal processes are, and to be able to predict a little bit more about how the coastline might respond to a certain change, like the construction of a groyne or something along those lines, so that we can resolve issues and not make issues worse for our neighbours or the site. In my presentation, I'm going to really step through 5 things. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the different types of models that are used by coastal engineers. And then going to talk about some of the selection processes and why we might choose a numerical model for some problems or a physical model for other problems, and look at about how we might arrange a physical model to solve a particular type of problem. I'm going to run through some nice examples of contemporary physical modelling projects that we've looked at in the past few years and give you an idea of the different types of physical models and how they're used for coastal problems. And then I'm going to provide a quick summary at the end on some of the advantages of physical modelling in particular as a tool, but modelling more broadly. So we've had a fair bit of discussion so far about modelling, but if we just take a little bit of a step back and think about what a model is more broadly, a model is just a representation of some process. And in the coastal zone, this process could be anything. It could be the waves breaking on the beach, which I've got some animations showing here for. But it could equally be the longshore drift, the simulation of that longshore drift process, for example, that was talked about before. Or it might be waves breaking on a coastal structure. And when we think about models in the coastal engineering sense, there's really 3 types of models we look at. There's empirical models which simulate that process using perhaps previous measurements from field data or laboratory studies. More complicated than that, there's numerical models, which are computer models where you solve some mathematical equations to simulate a process, and that's what's shown in the middle picture there. And then we have physical models, and a physical model really is nothing more than taking all the processes or the physics that's going on a site and scaling that down and making a small version of it. And we make sure all those physics or the key important processes are reproduced in the right proportion and the right forces. So in that bottom animation there is just showing a plunging wave breaking on a beach. And so we've got ways of scaling all these things down in a physical model to get those processes to reproduce properly. So they're kind of the 3 different types of models in the coastal engineering sense. In the coastal environment, it's been pointed out already, there's a few reasons why we might do some modelling. Really, what we want to do though is we want to be able to predict the response of a coastline or of a structure to the forces and the processes that are going on. So we might want to be able to understand the response of a beach if we put a groyne in or a seawall in or a breakwater in. We also want to be able to predict the response of a revetment or a structure to perhaps a typhoon or a large wave event, so that we don't get that wrong and we don't end up with failed structures all along our coastline. So the modelling really helps us to understand and to be able to predict these kind of things ahead of time before we go and build these structures. Models are also used to compare different options. They're used to demonstrate and engage with stakeholders to be able to show what the outcomes might be of a project. And they're used for risk assessment and management strategies. If we take a look at modelling in coastal engineering projects, when we're thinking about what kind of model we want to use, we can really think about it in a number of ways. What we have to have a look at is the size of the processes that we're looking to simulate. And I've got this on the vertical scale of this plot here, so the spatial scale from metres through to kilometres. And we also have to think of the time scale that the processes are happening over. So we might have, you know, really big scale processes that happen over days or months. And they might be things like ocean currents or tides, might be over hours or days, and they happen over a big area. Then we, you know, at the bottom end of the scale, we have things like wave overtopping, and that happens over seconds or minutes and a much more localized scale. And so when we're thinking of a modeling approach, it's often good to think about the spatial scale and the time scale that the processes are happening over. And from that, really what we see is that physical models are most suited to problems that happen over a shorter time scale and a smaller area. And so that's shown by the top right here, but we've got wave overtopping assets in a physical model. Compared with something like ocean currents that happen over a big scale, we can't capture that big physical scale in a physical model. That might be things like ocean currents. And then there's an area in between where you've got things like scour around structures and beach erosion. But generally, physical models are smaller, shorter duration processes like this. We also want to have a think of the complexity of the processes and what's going on. And the coastal zone is often a very complex place. You know, on the far right here, we've got very complex processes like waves causing damage to a structure, and we've got wave overtopping the scour. And then at the other end of the scale, we've got more simple processes. And so physical models are really suited to problems where there's a high degree of complexity versus numerical models that are probably best suited where there's a somewhat lower degree of complexity. And then on the right-hand side there, I'll show you two different types of model. Both from Darwin in the Northern Territory of Australia. The top photo shows a big spatial scale numerical model covering a big area and long duration processes. The bottom picture shows a wave slamming into a seawall with an overheating walkway, and the top of that seawall are actually measuring the loads that the waves apply for design purposes. So there's a very high degree of complexity in the bottom picture. It's very difficult to capture with a numerical model, for example, and those design loads accurately, so we might choose in terms of approaches to physical modelling, if we take a sort of a big structure like this reclamation here, this is a Western Australia project, it's an LNG project that was developed a few years ago. In this particular case, we could choose to do what's called a 2D model, which is a slice through the structure, just in two-dimensional. And we've got pictures of that model on the right-hand side here, where we're looking at the armour stability and the profile of the coastal protection. That's a very simple 2D physical model. Where things might start to have some three-dimensional processes, we could increase the complexity a little bit of the model. In this case, we've got models of the head of the reclamation and the head of the water structure here. In what we call a quasi-three-dimensional model, where we've got 2D ways, but breaking up three-dimensional. And then we have a full 3D model of the same structure. And this is where we're looking at, again, a high degree of complexity. We're looking at waves diffracting around the break of the head on the size of the waves and various different processes like that. So there's different ways that we can break a problem up and model it, and depending on the size of the project, we might do simple 2D modeling through to more complicated 3D. I'll quickly show you some examples of some nice physical modelling projects we've looked at in recent years. This one is from Abu Dhabi. In this particular case, we were modelling these large sandfield geotextile tube breakwaters. And in particular, it was to look at the arrangement of these breakwaters to provide protection to this nourished beach, this artificial beach for this locale. The physical model was used to look at waves overtopping the breakwaters and how the arrangement of the breakwaters impacted the currents behind the structures themselves, and to make sure those currents weren't too strong for swimming or for that sand to be stable behind the structures. The next example is the project called the Palm Beach Shoreline Project on the Gold Coast in Australia. This was an artificial reef that was being designed to build up sand on this beach behind it and to provide protection to these properties on the beach. In this case, there were actually 3 different physical models completed for this project. The first model was a big 3D wave model, and it was really focused on the shape of the reef and the size of the rock armor that was needed to be stable. The third model was, again, a larger scale 3D basin model, and it was really focused a little bit on the rock armor stability, but more on the hydrodynamics and the currents that the structure generated. So you can see here we're using some dye to look at the wave currents modeling that artificial reef. And we also have some lightweight sediment on the beach, looking at how that sediment is moving in response to that structure for different waves. The physical model really does allow a high degree of complexity to be reproduced, and you can see the shape of the waves and how the reef is deforming those waves and the subsequent impacts on the beach and the currents. That's just the structure and the construction in the top right there, and the finished structure dissipating waves in the bottom right. This particular project was a detached breakwater, and the model was used to investigate the structural design of the breakwater. So the right hand side here shows some laser scans of the model where we're looking at displacement of armor stones off the structure and trying to work out how big the rock needed to be and how high the crest should be. We were also looking at the response of the beach to this structure to make sure it wouldn't cause additional erosion and in fact generate some erosion. This example here is for a jetty structure, and we're using the physical model to measure wave impact loading and get the structural design forces on that particular structure to feed back to the engineer's design. And lastly, this is an example of just a 2D revetment model where we're using this model to investigate again the size of the rock armor to provide a stable solution, and also the height of the crest that the revetment to use this type of and you can actually see under some of the bigger waves here that the armor stones are actually dynamic, so the waves actually so the physical model again allows us to visualize the problem and be able to predict very accurately how big those stones should be. So in summary, physical models and numerical models are both great design tools for coastal problems to allow us to predict ahead of time how a piece of coastline will respond to perhaps an invention or to a future Physical models have particular advantages where there's a high degree of complexity. So if we're trying to look at something like waves impacting on a seawall, and we want to be able to build that seawall strong enough that it doesn't fail or make problems worse. Or where perhaps you might have a structure that would cause additional erosion to your neighbours. And it's very complicated, there's a lot of things going on, which is often the case in coastal problems. That's where physical models are the best solution we have to simulate that. They allow us to visualise real situations at small scale and to be able to test changes to the design quite quickly and look at the implications of those changes. As James said, they really allow us to have the ability to save on construction costs and optimise design costs. So disadvantages, they're limited in the spatial scale that we can reproduce, and they're limited in the duration of the impacts we can reproduce. Contemporary physical models, though, they're not usually used. Perhaps in the older days, like James showed, they were used as a sole design tool. In these days, they're nearly always used in combination with numerical models. So you might have a computer model predicting wave processes for a bigger area, and then that forms the boundary condition for a physical model, for example. So it's almost always a partnership is the best approach these days. And we like to see physical models used in stages of the project. Really can be for rapid concept or proof of concept testing, all the way through to design verification. Again, very useful for different purposes at different points in the project. And as I showed, it's often cost effective to break a project up into several smaller physical models. Physical modeling in a nutshell in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Really interesting presentation. Fascinating to see that 200 years ago, the models already being used, see how they developed and the advantages they can bring to a project. Really clear, interesting, and fantastic. Thanks very much. We have about 40 minutes left in our webinar, so we have one presentation left and we'll finish up with some questions. Our final speaker today is Phan Hai Pham, and he joins us from Kangluk. Phan Hai graduated from the University of Transport and Communications with an MBA degree in project management. His experience in major infrastructure projects such as the Immersive Tunnel project in Saigon, Metro Railway here in Saigon, and the Trout Wind Farm.
Kiểu như
For those that are
có thể
listening
up
to the
cao nữa hả?
interpretation, you may need to switch over. It's in Vietnamese. So at the bottom of your screen on the right hand side, you see the interpretation option. Click the button you're looking for and enjoy this presentation.
Đi sang dự án mà mua xong rồi là mua audio TV2 mua là lập nick cho mỗi thằng dựa trên một cái nick là nó mua với giá 20.000. Ví dụ như nó bữa nó nhờ em này biên tập được là BBC dùng đó cái tài khoản để cho nó tham gia audio là một cái kêu là mỗi thằng xin tao cho 200 là cái đẹp audio đó là bỏ cái nhóm của nó bỏ 100 triệu chỉ để tiền công cho anh em, nói là 100 triệu là tiền công cho anh em mà nhận được cái đúng rồi cho BBC cho nó đủ á. Rồi sau đó là cái nhóm nói chung là đó là mỗi thằng hồi giờ đó là kiếm được 200 là cái nhóm đó là mấy thằng đó là kiếm được 750. Có 100 triệu à, nhưng mà khổ lắm khi phải thức đêm thức hôm và đi theo xe đi để kiếm người làm đủ người đủ số lượng thì nó mới được lên. Đó là mấy ngày kiếm được mấy ngày thì cái độ nó kiếm được 1,5 triệu rồi. Chia ra thì mỗi thằng 200 là một phần làm chỉ có trai thôi, chứ còn mà làm mấy cái dự án này như đại dự án này là phải có tiền. Trai chữ cơm thôi, trai dụ như trai nó chơi full mà game thì chỉ dám 8 triệu, 2 triệu, 3 triệu cái đó rất nhiều. Nhưng mà cái đó là chưa đúng rồi, mấy cái đánh mỗi lần đánh thường là anh thấy nó chơi thường là nó đánh 2 triệu, đánh 2 triệu trái vậy bước 2 triệu đó, nhưng mà mỗi lần nó đồng nó kim đồng lên là tầm 1 triệu 2 triệu rồi đâu tập tiền đó. Hồi bữa em chơi mày chỉ tao đi. Em kêu không là cái này đầu tiên thì chết sớm rồi. Không phải tài vốn nó nhiều, thành ra nó có 1 triệu, 2 triệu, 3 triệu, 5 triệu nó mất không có tiền hết. Cho nên nhưng mà nó nhận tiếp 200 một tấm, còn nó chơi đến 15 phút á thì tầm tiếng sau là lấy dư tiền lại rồi. Còn mình mà vốn cho nên mình về tâm lý đó, nó tiền nhiều quá cho nên dẹp thì nó không có tiền đó.
Our main business focus on renewable energy,
ở đây bờ kênh tầm cuối năm nay hết rồi,
bạn anh nó cũng chơi forex nhưng mà nó là tiền kiếm được cũng ngon lắm, nhưng mà lúc mà lỗ thì lỗ cái bà luôn, kiểu như 8 giờ nó ngủ sáng dậy má lỗ bả rồi.
Em thấy cái người mà có đặt lỗ
đặt làm tự động không?
đúng rồi, anh thì ăn
The inner
thì
marina
ăn rồi có thì lỗ 2 lỗ 3 thôi nhưng mà như mình thấy cái đó đúng rồi khi mình bỏ em
trả lại thôi.
mình bỏ em thì mình cũng qua chi phí thôi làm gì trong cái đó thì tiền
and repayment and other features.
có lợi nhuận phải bỏ chi phí chứ làm có tiền mà cứ ngồi thu tiền không
The Eastern refinery
Rồi
project
bước để tiến hành bước hả?
construction of 2.8 km store of dam driving at estimated for high operation.
không rất tốt nhưng mà chắc là đang vào
The
sống
last
cho nên là
section is a
rất đúng
difficulty,
thôi
challenge and solution. Public may
Mà tức đó với máy lái rồi nó chạy.
bây giờ đang vào sống thì nó không tính lọt đúng đó
Máy lái không hiểu kiểu gì luôn.
đang vào sống không tính lọt nào rồi em phải phải video đúng ra đúng phim mà nó thả ra cái phim video nhưng mà đó lúc đang vào sống thôi chứ còn khi dịch xong vẽ mà mẹ luôn vẽ không ra nữa.
Total erosion, inaccurate local
Chả
weather
có được.
forecast, evacuation plan, and the last is construction equipment.
Nó giống như đang đáy mà. Nó giống như đang đáy mà. Giờ ở mấy đường bay kia là khúc lên mấy gì đó.
Này lại đúng không? Mình bán mua. Còn đấy mà đấy nhỏ thì là phải cái gì đó.
Thôi nó mở hết mấy đường bay kia nữa mà. Chứ sao một lần bay tốn 500 cả tỷ đồng mà bay như người đâu.
Bây giờ phải vô mình lái vô bây giờ mình nhắm vô xả con
Vậy đó là giọng cao nhưng mà cao.
bây giờ tao bây giờ qua vừa dự án nó chặt cái dự án
Whereby the 0.3 to 0.4 meter
nhắm vô xả con
under 10 meter per second or line range. Nearshore process, especially in the tidal zone, always affected by different water level in the day, with usual tidal range between 2 and 3 meters, sometimes 5 is
sói lở bờ của mấy gì ven biển á.
tidal range table hour.
Mà không biết ông bay cái gì, số chất điều kiện à.
cái xéo
Lọc điều kiện đúng không?
cái xéo rồi thằng nào màu nào
The protection of brick is faded by Spanish Tibet, and the right one is the reverse protection of brick in archive and the stoppage of die work. The art is flexible planning execution. Also, erosion. Vietnam is one of the few countries heavily suffered
Thì
from
nói với mấy gì mình nhớ nè, mình nhớ như sao
đây là của mấy mà
của hay con đi
This picture shows the new view structure
đang đi cái tiền không giờ bận quá đúng quá
stability and weight.
cực kỳ này xong đúng không?
Anh thấy cũng kỳ cực ghê quá không giờ ngồi
chứ không tu BTC
thì hết tuần này làm sao chút thế là làm sao để xuống để ở đây biết được gì hết.
In detail, the seaway crack to the foundation structure resulting turbulent flow, weight, mud and
xe khoan chưa vô mà, xe khoan xương đất chưa vô mà, đâu hay chụp
nó mới đem trạm độ đúng không?
Nó mới nhập xi măng à,
nhập xi măng rồi đem silo đem đổ silo mà
mình chưa thấy bể trộn, nhưng chưa thấy mấy
based on the design data of leader American. The strongest storm ever season only 25 years ago in 1997.
mà phải tuần cái tuần này là cái tuần sau cái
without any protection. The right feature
tuần
shows
sau
the
cái môn kia
protected
xong cái
solution. Conduct acknowledge this potential risk. So
cực quá
we
đã học
design
cho xong
and
rồi sao
build
lúc ba thì đi học
the
mệt quá mà
speedy one die
đủ
to
rồi
check the
cuộc đời chỉ là quá
sediment,
đủ rồi.
thereby reducing reflective weight by pressing to the die. And this is the sediment accumulated in base of 3 die. Inaccurate local weather forecast. This figure of weather forecast is a bit. This picture shows the weather forecast by the licensed version, but it is not correct as a working reason because there are not enough the hydrometeorological station to monitor the weather figure throughout the country, causing trouble for the contractor to set up the release schedule for the project. Here is the map describing the evacuation route for equipment in emergency aid. This is the same refugee location on river for equipment after evacuation. Refugee area for equipment and workforce shall be planned in advance and practiced in prior before extreme weather happens. Choosing the distance from side pond to refugee pond or mother pond is very important for safety solution and should be as near as possible while it can harmonize with working schedule and safety issue, and with the motto safety is the first priority. Other issue and solution. Compared with offshore construction, the legal regulation for offshore construction work is stricter than onshore, like mandatory marine safety plan, marine safety surveyor, vessel register, SFP class. Most of the sites have no approachable access. They various permit approval from government like border police for entrance of equipment and regular agreement for location of construction on sea. The EIA assessment, the environmental impact assessment on how to protect the environment, aquatic, resort, coral, for environment conduct and acknowledge the issue and equip with acoustic wave and current profiler AWAC to measure current and wave for the purpose of study tidal currents, coastal erosion, design data for planning of new coastal structure. The material for offshore work frequently to react with highly radiated sunshine, low wind, static corrosion of seawater, thereby material criteria shall be higher than onshore structure, and mandate a covering system to protect structure like painting, galvanizing layer for steel, epoxy, or silica impregnation coating for concrete structure, heavier thickness for steel and concrete cover. The equipment suited with offshore work are very scarce, old, easily broken, mobilization taking for a long time. The workforce to be familiar with offshore work is very few, hardly recruited with good physical health, can visit again, travel ship on sea, or work anytime when weather is workable. As such reason, the contractor must have the contingency plan, planning a backup equipment and manpower for nearshore work. So as to catch up the schedule, why not know how the upcoming weather is and the deadline is very tight, so that the cost shall be increased approximately by 30% in budget. Finally, Kang had creatively devised the suitable planning working methods, the specialized equipment to deal with all the challenges and difficulties. This is the end of my topic today. If you have any query relating to the matter, you can ask us at the QA section or please reach out to us on the website. Thank you for watching.
Hi, very interesting presentation again. I'd like to thank all our panelists for their presentations, all very interesting, very informative, covering a wide range of topics, and all finishing exactly on time. So good to see we have time for Q&A, and I've seen quite a few questions coming through already. Some of them have already been answered or responded to in the chat. I'm going to pick a few of them anyway, because I think it's good to discuss them a little bit more here with the panelists. And I hope you're going to stay with us for this section as well. So we started off with the presentation by Simon and looking at the work the World Bank has been doing and how the World Bank has been funding projects in Vietnam. And one of the questions that came up was about the role of PPP. And let me just see what the question was. It says, it's very clear that erosion hazards are real and increasing in the coast of Vietnam. How does the World Bank advise Vietnam of possible integrated solutions? How can PPP scheme be applicable here? Would you like to answer, Matthijs and Zoom?
Yeah, let me take the first kick and Martijn come in afterward. Thank you very much for the question. I think this is a very interesting question. Again, as we presented in the slide, that the erosion is actually part of the multiple problem in the coastal area, which actually caused by the natural hazard or natural dynamic of the coastal area, but it's also due to the human intervention. In many places, actually the wrong intervention in the coast actually cause more problem for the communities and the business activity there. So at the first step, I think for the long-term and sustainable solution, it had to be also to be better understanding. Again, it's not to the individual individual person or individual in the government system or any partner, but also to view the better understanding of the risks through the planning and the decision-making process in both the government and communities and also private sector as well, because you see a lot of, the case of Phan Thiet, for instance, you see the individual intervention of the resort owner actually create in our views, create more problem for the erosion prevention, but also create a problem for the tourist business development, as the coast look more ugly and more dangerous to tourists. So this is very important. The second of all actually is to maximize the efforts from the different player in this field, particularly, like the PPP is one of the opportunities for both the government, the publics, and also private sector to work together and to maximize the resources, but also
tối ưu cái nguồn lực cũng như là tối ưu cái lợi ích từ các cái giải pháp phòng chống xói lở.
Require some sort of larger scale intervention to prevent the erosion that benefit to the resort owner, but also the community living along the coast. In this case, provide exactly the very good opportunity for those triangle, let's say, the triangle coordination and collaboration, particularly between the public sectors, the private and the community to work together for this. So I will stop here. Over to Marta, if you want to add something more.
Maybe one thing to add, the question is also about, let's say, how does the World Bank support Vietnam? So the case of Vietnam was an example of a project that was done in very close collaboration with the Vietnamese government and also the stakeholders in the region. So there was a very intense stakeholder process to develop, let's say, together with public and also private stakeholders, this solution. So in that way, we try to, as the World Bank, we try to support, of course, let's say, some sort of and introduce a new line of thinking about, let's say, how can we further support the development of these more integrated and large-scale solutions rather than, let's say, what Drew already was saying, these spot solutions for individual assets, and also help to foster the discussion between the private and public sector about how can perhaps a scheme look like and how can it be financed, let's say, between both by both, let's say, public resources, but also by private resources, because both have an interest in this coastal zone. And both also are already investing in the coastal zone, but through a more integrated solution, let's say, also those resources could possibly be invested in a more efficient way. With that, back to you, Justin.
Thanks very much. Joost, I've got a question. It's a two-part question for you. The first part is, does coastal erosion depend on the region, or is it the same along the whole coast of Vietnam? And then the second question, which I've linked to this, is, are there examples of works that are considered successful, and can we copy and paste as we go along where we see?
That's an interesting questions, of course. So I think answering the first question, so the answer is no. So the question was, are these solutions or the concepts and erosion and the solutions the same along the coastline of Vietnam? So the answer is no. Obviously, when we look at the coastline, especially in the middle of Vietnam, we see a lot of sandy coastlines or rocky coastlines, and the Mekong Delta, and further north, the Red River Delta. Often they are more natural. For instance, in the south, we have a lot of mangroves. So the causes of erosion are different. So there's different processes. Different processes are in play, let's say, which makes the coastline erode. But I think the concepts are the same. So the concepts are presented, the natural dynamics, human interventions or climate change, those concepts are the same, but the way we should look at the different systems is different. So I think if we, let's say, if we would study coastal erosion and come up with, let's say, solutions in terms of planning or structural solutions, you would also then choose differently because the processes are differently, and therefore the solutions are also differently. I hope that answers the question.
And then maybe add one thing, Joost, just into this, and it's also a response to what was just said in the chat. I think the coastal erosion and the coastal processes that we've been mainly discussing, I think today, are mainly, let's say, the issues that we see in the, let's say, the so-called closed coast, where there is a lot of effect of the outflowing rivers. But there are, of course, also sections along the Vietnamese coast where you see that the rivers flow out into the sea and also provide sediment towards the coast. So in those sections, and that's also what we did with in this hotspot analysis as a resilient shores program. And we also looked specifically for those areas also to the effect of the river and also include that part into the analysis, because I think what is being said in the chat, I think, is very true. I think for those particular areas, I think it's also very important to take the river and the outflow of the river and the sediments provided by the river to the coast also carefully into account, because those can also affect. If you have, for instance, pockets of sediment in a river by a reservoir, it can also lead to, let's say, a shortage of sediment at the coast, and also, let's say, a regression of the coastline. It is a different mechanism, but it's in certain places definitely also ongoing.
And And may I add here, that's very quick. I saw some of the question related about the coastal erosion in the Mekong Delta. So our colleague Mark I just mentioned about there's the blocking of the sedimentation transport from the river to the coast is one of the key. I think is one of the key counter erosion in the coastal in the Mekong Delta as well, because in the recent look back in the past few years, you see a lot of sand mining were booming in the Mekong deltas, and that actually is made actually also to capture a lot of sand that was supposed to be actually run out to the river mouth and the coastal area can supply for the coastal for the coastal line. But at the same time, what you have already aware in upstream, there were a lot of reservoir actually built partly in especially in further upstream countries like China. You see also block a lot of the sand moving down from upstream to down. So again, erosion is actually about the balance of the sands between the upstream to the downstream anyway. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Next, over to James and Matt. It's getting late in Sydney. I hope you're still feeling sharp. I see there's already been quite some discussion in the chat on this question, but I think it's good to open it up to you to just elaborate a bit more. And the question comes down to, what is the relationship between a physical model and a numerical model? And is it practical or believable to just use a physical model?
I unmuted first, so I'll speak first if you like, but I'll let Matt. Matt had some slides in his presentation that did cover this. So ultimately, it comes down to engineering experience and engineering judgment to choose the best tool to solve any particular problem. And any complex real-world coastal problem, it will be a range of tools to apply. So it will be a numerical model for some of the processes, for example, the waves and the longshore sand transport. It will be using desktop methods, so pulling out reference books like Shore Protection Manual or Coastal Engineering Manual to come up with a preliminary design if you're going to design structures, and then to get the structure design right, you'd most likely use a physical model to size the structure, look at the forces, look at wave overtopping. So it's very unlikely nowadays you would use a physical model for everything, but before the advent of computers, that was how things were often done. So there was large physical models as big as a football field of pieces of coast were done in the 1940s and 1950s. But as computers started taking off in the 1960s, they started being able to solve a lot of the problems, a lot of the more simple problems, and then that becomes the interface with the physical model. So yeah, you use a combination of all three, and a lot of the skill and the judgment is to know what might be the best tool to solve each part of the problem.
Brilliant. Matt, do you want to add anything to that?
Look, I agree with what James is saying. You know, that's exactly right. And the most successful projects I've seen, in particular for complex situations, have always drawn on different tools to provide a solution, and really the experience and judgment of the engineers to pick the best parts from the different tools and say, this is our solution. That's where the tricky bit is. Any of the models, physical or numerical, are only as good as the information that's driving them, and they all have boundary conditions and that kind of thing. So often these days, as I pointed out, you know, a coastline is not a confined compartment. A coastline has things coming into it, whether that's waves or whether that's sediment or what have you. So a physical model could never really capture all of those things coming into it. At some point, you have to have waves entering, or you have to have water level changing or sand coming and going. And so a physical model can never capture all of that scale. So you have to have some way of driving that physical model, and that's where a numerical model is particularly useful. At the heart of it, though, it depends on what you're looking at. If you purely wanted to look at a structure response to a wave, say a revetment response to a wave, and you had a very good understanding of what that wave was that was impacting the structure, or a force on a structure, for example, what is the force on this structure from a 6 metre high wave, then a physical model would be able to tell you that. directly, but it's how you come up with that wave that you're driving it with that you know what the design is. Do you need to look more widely on other tools?
Nice and clear. Thanks, Matt. Van Hai, I've got a question for you. You mentioned that the weather predictions are often not reliable. What does this generally mean for Kangdok as the contractor when they're working in the marine environment? What consequences does it have, and how do you deal with that?
Yes, thank you for your question. You know, the weather forecast is mostly only the zone by zone. It's not accurate at the working site. For the working site, actually we monitor by an hour experience. So we will observe daily and hourly. By that observation and the weather condition, so we will decide whether work or withdraw our equipment. During the monsoon season, you know, very hardly for execution. Now we are still working in Kamau province. So based on our experience, mostly, and with our backup planning, and the duration, the working duration is mostly will be extended by the reason, and we have the contingency plan, the backup plan, or to increase equipment when the calm day to better the schedule as I said earlier. That's why the focusing rate for daily offshore mostly increase. We can take rate approximately 30%. Some special case about 50%.
We've got time for 2 more questions before we wrap it up. So we can both open questions, so feel free to respond, any of our panelists. The first one is a question: what actions, if any, are taken by the Vietnamese government with regard to the issue of coastal erosion? So a bit of a tricky question, but what do we see, what measures do we see being taken by the government, especially in recent years, to address coastal erosion?
Well, yeah, this is a very tricky question, I think. The answer could be yes and no. Yes, the government, if you've seen, also have been taking a couple of action, to prevent the erosion. But those action actually were very just in the ad hoc and emergency cases. At the same time, from the experiences working in Vietnam, partly with the government, I still haven't seen any actually the comprehensive and long-term program for prevention of the coastal erosion in the country as well. If you see, many projects actually invested by the government and some other partner. However, those projects actually really look at quite small scale and local program of a certain trust of the coastal. So as I mentioned in our presentation, that the World Bank is now working with the government. Actually, the government had already formulated after this analysis supported by the World Bank. The government formulated sort of long-term program, comprehensive program to prevent the, let's say, to build the resilience of the coastal areas, including also the erosion prevention, but also coastal flooding and other hazards in the coastal line. That demonstrate the second part of my answer regarding no. Thank you.
Anybody want to add anything to that? I think the that was quite a good response. Okay, let's have one final question then. And this one is probably also a difficult one to answer, but I'm interested to hear if any of the panelists have a view on this. In terms of the cost magnitude, how much will coastal protection increase, let's say per kilometer length or less, due to climate change?
It's a very difficult question to answer, but I would turn around the question. I would more ask the question: how much, let's say, would be lost if you don't invest in these kind of protection solutions? And so often, I think what we see is obviously, yeah, these are not for free, but yeah, I think everybody shared on all these presentations that we should also look at how much is protected. So these are big numbers. So answering the question in a, let's say, absolute way will be very difficult. But I think people can imagine how much is being saved if you don't protect, if you have to protect it. Yeah.
Anybody else want to add to that?
I'll just say a few words. A lot of it is associated with the design life of the works that we undertake as well. And most coastal design, most structural design is for typically a 50-year life. And certainly climate change goes for a longer horizon than that as well. So we're not necessarily trying to make these schemes last in perpetuity because society changes as well. Yeah, a pretty good example. Not long before I was born, the very first Russian Sputnik satellite went up into the air in 1959. And now probably everyone watching this has now got a phone like this, mapping into satellites only about 60 years later. So things do change in the world, is what I'm saying. So we're designing initially for, say, 50 years, but climate change will continue beyond that. It's rare to design schemes for, say, more than 100 years in most parts of the world. So that's what adaptive management and adaptive planning is all about, is just setting up pathways, setting up points in the cycle where you may reevaluate things and change direction on it. So it's not about setting up a linear direction now necessarily for 100 years.
May I come in here just 1 minute, Justin? Okay. You know, in addition to actually, of course, it's also very challenging actually to forecast about the future erosion caused by the climate change anyway, as you know, our panelist member already respond. But putting aside, actually, if you look to in the case of Vietnam, for instance, if you look to the current rapid development of the access and the business along the coast of Vietnam right now, we see a lot of, we have also from our study, we actually found out that you know, most of the ecosystem like coral reef, mangrove, and natural dune, for instance, particularly natural dune is one of the very you know, one of the best natural protection system along the coast actually have been destroyed. Many tourist development projects, many hotel, many development industrial and urban development actually destroys those kind of existing system. I think if we continue like this, then the erosion is become more and more serious, even aside of the impact of climate change or flood. Thus ourselves, the human development themselves actually made have been making the big issue a bigger issue for the coastal stabilize in Vietnam.
I think that is a brilliant end to what has been a very interesting webinar. I'd like to thank our panel speakers. I have thoroughly enjoyed this afternoon. I've enjoyed the presentations, all very informative, all very interesting. You all come with a great wealth of knowledge. Thank you for that. I'd like to thank everybody who joined us for the webinar today. Thank you for taking 2 hours out of your day to join us. I hope you found it informative. I hope you enjoyed it. I know there's a lot of questions that we maybe did not have a chance to answer. So I would encourage you to connect with the speakers through LinkedIn. Or if you can't find them on LinkedIn, drop us an email, respond to the invite that you received, and we'll make sure to put you in contact with the relevant speaker. I'd also like to just make a few thanks to some of the people in the background, our marketing and communications team, Lynn in particular, for the great work she's done in setting all of this up and making sure that you were all aware of this webinar. And to Bin, our interpreter, I did jump into it for a little bit, and it looked like you were extremely busy. Thanks for that. Thank you, everyone. The webinar has been recorded. It will be made available online if you have missed part of it, or if you want to see parts of it again. And we look forward to seeing you again in the future. I'm sure we will have more of these. Thanks then. Goodbye.